African Americans are an ethnic group of Americans with total or partial ancestry from any of the black racial groups of Africa. The term may also be used to include only those individuals who are descended from enslaved Africans. As a compound adjective, the term is usually hyphenated as African American. Black and African Americans constitute the third largest racial and ethnic group in the United States. Most African Americans are of West and Central African descent and are descendants of enslaved peoples within the boundaries of the present United States. On average, African Americans are of 73.2 to 80.9% West African, 18 to 24% European, and 0.8 to 0.9% Native American heritage, with large variation between individuals. According to U.S. Census Bureau data, African immigrants generally do not self-identify as African American. The overwhelming majority of African immigrants identify instead with their own respective ethnicities. Immigrants from some Caribbean, Central American and South American nations and their descendants may or may not also self-identify with the term. African American history starts in the 16th century, with peoples from West Africa forcibly taken as slaves to Spanish America, and in the 17th century with West African slaves taken to English colonies in North America. After the founding of the United States, black people continued to be enslaved, with 4 million denied freedom from bondage prior to the Civil War. Believed to be inferior to white people, they were treated as second-class citizens. The Naturalization Act of 1790 limited U.S. citizenship to whites only, and only white men of property could vote. These circumstances were changed by Reconstruction, development of the black community, participation in the great military conflicts of the United States, the elimination of racial segregation, and the civil rights movement which sought political and social freedom. In 2008, Barack Obama became the first African American to be elected President of the United States. History: Colonial era. The first African slaves arrived via Santo Domingo to the San Miguel de Gualdape colony, founded by Spanish explorer Lucas Vázquez Dryon in 1526. The ill-fated colony was almost immediately disrupted by a fight over leadership, during which the slaves revolted and fled the colony to seek refuge among local Native Americans. Dryon and many of the colonists died shortly afterwards of an epidemic and the colony was abandoned. The settlers and the slaves who had not escaped returned to Haiti, whence they had come. The first recorded Africans in British North America were 20-odd Negroes, who came to Jamestown, Virginia via Cape Comforty in August 1619 as indentured servants. As English settlers died from harsh conditions, more and more Africans were brought to work as laborers. Typically, young men or women would sign a contract of indenture in exchange for transportation to the New World. The landowner received 50 acres of land from the state for each servant purchased from a ship's captain. An indentured servant would work for several years without wages. The status of indentured servants in early Virginia and Maryland was similar to slavery. Servants could be bought, sold, or leased, and they could be physically beaten for disobedience or running away. Unlike slaves, they were freed after the term of service expired or was bought out. The children did not inherit the status, and on the release from contract they received a year's provision of corn, double apparel, tools necessary, and a small cash payment called freedom dues. Africans could legally raise crops and cattle to purchase the freedom. They raised families, married other Africans and sometimes intermarried with Native Americans or English settlers. By the 1640s and 1650s, several African families owned farms around Jamestown and some became wealthy by colonial standards and purchased indentured servants of their own. In 1640, the Virginia General Court recorded the earliest documentation of lifetime slavery when they sentenced Jean Punch, a Negro, to lifetime servitude under his master Huguin for running away. One of Dutch African arrivals, Anthony Johnson, would later own one of the first black slaves, John Cassaw, resulting from the court ruling of a civil case. The popular conception of a race-based slave system did not fully develop until the 18th century. The Dutch West India Company introduced slavery in 1625 with the importation of 11 black slaves into New Amsterdam. All the colony's slaves, however, were freed upon its surrender to the British. Massachusetts was the first British colony to legally recognize slavery in 1641. In 1662, Virginia passed a law that children of enslaved women took the status of the mother, rather than that of the father, as under English common law. This principle was called partus sequitur ventrum. By an act of 1699, the colony ordered all free blacks deported, virtually defining as slaves all persons of African descent who remained in the colony. In 1670, the Colonial Assembly passed a law prohibiting free and baptized Negroes from purchasing Christians but allowing them to buy persons of their own nation. The earliest African-American congregations and churches were organized before 1800 in both northern and southern cities following the Great Awakening. By 1775, Africans made up 20% of the population in the American colonies, which made them the second largest ethnic group after the English. For the American Revolution to the Civil War during the 1770s, Africans, both enslaved and free, helped rebellious English colonists secure American independence by defeating the British in the American Revolution. Africans and Englishmen fought side by side and were fully integrated. Blacks played a role in both sides in the American Revolution. Activists in the Patriot cause included James Armistead, Prince Whipple and Oliver Cromwell. The question of slavery, although nowhere mentioned explicitly in the U.S. Constitution, was one of the most difficult for the framers to deal with, resulting in the Three-Fifths Compromise. Slavery, which by then meant almost exclusively African Americans, was the most important political issue in the antebellum United States, leading to one crisis after another. Among these were the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act, and the Dred Scott decision. By 1860, there were 3.5 to 4.4 million enslaved African Americans in the United States due to the Atlantic slave trade, and another 488,000–500,000 African Americans lived free across the country. The slaves not only constituted a large investment, they produced America's most valuable product and export, cotton. They not only helped build the U.S. Capitol, they built the White House and other District of Columbia buildings. Similar building projects existed in slaveholding states. In 1863, during the American Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. The proclamation declared that all slaves in Confederate-held territory were free. Advancing Union troops enforced the proclamation, with Texas being the last state to be emancipated. In 1865, slavery in Union-held Confederate territory continued, at least on paper, until the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865. Reconstruction and Jim Crow African Americans quickly set up congregations for themselves, as well as schools and community civic associations, to have space away from white control or oversight. While the post-war Reconstruction era was initially a time of progress for African Americans, that period ended in 1876. By the late 1890s, Southern states enacted Jim Crow laws to enforce racial segregation and disenfranchisement. Most African Americans obeyed the Jim Crow laws in order to avoid racially motivated violence. To maintain self-esteem and dignity, African Americans such as Anthony Overton and Mary McLeod Bethune continued to build their own schools, churches, banks, social clubs, and other businesses. In the last decade of the 19th century, racially discriminatory laws and racial violence aimed at African Americans began to mushroom in the United States. These discriminatory acts included racial segregation, upheld by the United States Supreme Court decision in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, which was legally mandated by Southern states and nationwide at the local level of government, voter suppression and disenfranchisement in the Southern states, denial of economic opportunity or resources nationwide, and private acts of violence and mass racial violence aimed at African Americans unhindered or encouraged by government authorities. Great Migration and Civil Rights Movement. The desperate conditions of African Americans in the South that sparked the Great Migration of the early 20th century, combined with a growing African American community in the northern United States, led to a movement to fight violence and discrimination against African Americans that, like abolitionism before it, crossed racial lines. The Civil Rights Movement from 1954 to 1968 was directed at abolishing racial discrimination against African Americans, particularly in the southern United States. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom and the conditions which brought it into being accredited with putting pressure on President John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson put his support behind passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that banned discrimination in public accommodations, employment, and labor unions, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which expanded federal authority over states to ensure black political participation through protection of voter registration and elections. By 1966, the emergence of the Black Power movement, which lasted from 1966 to 1975, expanded upon the aims of the Civil Rights Movement to include economic and political self-sufficiency and freedom from white authority. During the post-war period, many African Americans continued to be economically disadvantaged relative to other Americans. Average black income stood at 54% of that of white workers in 1947 and 55% in 1962. In 1959, median family income for whites was $5,600, compared with $2,900 for non-white families. In 1965, 43% of all black families fell into the poverty bracket, earning under $3,000 a year. The 60s saw improvements in the social and economic conditions of many black Americans. From 1965 to 1969, black family income rose from 54% to 60% of white family income. In 1968, 23% of black families earned under $3,000 a year, compared with 41% in 1960. In 1965, 19% of black Americans had incomes equal to the national median, a proportion that rose to 27% by 1967. In 1960, the median level of education for blacks had been 10.8 years, and by the late 60s the figure rose to 12.2 years, half a year behind the median for whites. Post-Civil Rights era politically and economically, African Americans have made substantial strides during the post-Civil Rights era. In 1989, Douglas Wilder became the first African American elected governor in U.S. history. Clarence Thomas became the second African-American Supreme Court Justice. In 1992, Carol Moseley Brown of Illinois became the first African-American woman elected to the U.S. Senate. There were 8,936 black officeholders in the United States in 2000, showing a net increase of 7,467 since 1970. In 2001 there were 484 black mayors. In 2005, the number of Africans immigrating to the United States in a single year surpassed the peak number who were involuntarily brought to the United States during the Atlantic slave trade. On November 4, 2008, Democratic Senator Barack Obama defeated Republican Senator John McCain to become the first African American to be elected president. At least 95% of African American voters voted for Obama. He also received overwhelming support from young and educated whites, a majority of Asians, Hispanics, and Native Americans, picking up a number of new states in the Democratic electoral column. Obama lost the overall white vote, although he won a larger proportion of white votes than any previous non-incumbent Democratic presidential candidate since Jimmy Carter. 4 years later, Obama was re-elected president by a similar margin on November 6, 2012.